monsters. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of MurderMurder.news' podcast, which also serves as a weekly meeting for our very own true crime cult.
But don't worry, you've landed in the cult with all the baby goats and none of the brainwashing. Grab a flower crown and take a seat around the fire as we dig into another tale of murder.
In case you're just finding us now, allow us to introduce ourselves. I'm your favorite true crime pixie, Angelina, and I'm here with the real housewife of true crime herself, Aurora. How are you doing this week?
I am still in COVID corner, pushing through.
We live in COVID corner. It's a multi-international corner that we all reside in. It's great.
Yeah. So, bear with us today. Much more than a week for Angelina into this. We're still struggling a little bit, but we wanted to hang out with y'all, so we're pushing through.
Yeah, we're excited to keep up with MMN and keep in touch with all of you, all of our spooky pals. But we really appreciate your patience as we are a little loopy still.
Yes. So just because you're a listener of our podcast, we do consider you to be an honorary monster. But if you'd like to officially join the MMN commune, you can do so on Patreon. Just head over to patreon.com/MurderMurder.news and pledge just a few bucks a month to get unlimited access to our monthly Patreon exclusive episodes. Plus, we'll give you an official title like Deacon or Grandmaster of Goats, and we will name one of our adorable baby goats in your honor.
If you tuned in last week, you already heard the news that we've joined the Darkcast podcast network. Don't forget to follow Darkcast Network on social media. You might just discover your next favorite podcast. If you like Murder Murder News, you'll love Darkcast's selection of true crime, spooky, and paranormal podcasts.
Now let's take a look at some of the true crime stories that have been making headlines this week. Police have released 2 more names of victims of a man now known as a shopping cart killer. DNA evidence was used to identify 29-year-old Cheyenne Brown from Washington, D.C., and 48-year-old Stephanie Harrison from Redding, California. We first talked about this case on our December 10th episode, and I've been kind of casually following this. It's gotten pretty wild. But we reported at that time that Anthony Eugene Robinson had been arrested for the murders of 54-year-old Elizabeth Bed Redman and 39-year-old Tanita Lorice Nita Smith. It's now believed that Anthony is responsible for the murders of all 4 women who he transported in shopping carts to dispose of their bodies. A 5th woman has also been found dead in a shopping cart, but police have not yet released her identity and have not charged Anthony with her death at this time.
Interesting story. That's something I've never heard the likes of before. Bodies in shopping carts. Wow.
It's really interesting, and I feel like we don't hear a lot about active serial killers in the 2020s, and so this one's really interesting, and I have not yet found many, or if any, details about cause of death or what was going on here, so I am interested in finding out more details as this goes to court, but super sad, super messed up, and definitely stay tuned and keep an eye on our website for more details as they come out.
Yeah, that's another good one where you mentioned that they don't do a lot of talk about current serial killers. And I'm always perplexed by people being like, oh, serial killers happened in the 70s and 80s and it's over now. Nuh-uh. So there's a shopping cart killer and countless others that you've never heard of. We'll try and
this is not
bringing that all to the surface.
This is not really making big news. I've only heard little reports of it here and there. And I was reading about this in December when we had reported on it. And I haven't heard anything since. And I just happened to see a little thing pop up in my Facebook newsfeed about the shopping cart killer. And I looked it up and was like, wait, is this the same guy that killed the other 2 women that we were talking about in December? Wow. And sure enough. So it's not getting a lot of coverage. So we will make sure that it is in the news because these women deserve justice.
Absolutely. This week, a man has been arrested for the 1986 abduction and murder of 4-year-old Jessica Gutierrez. Jessica was kidnapped from her home in Lexington, South Carolina, sometime after midnight on June 6, 1986. Her sister told her family that a man with a magic hat and beard had taken her. A massive search ensued, but Jessica was never found. and her case sat cold for over 35 years. This past September, her case was reopened by prosecutors in South Carolina along with the FBI. They re-reviewed the 3,500-page case file and interviewed 125 people with connections to the case. A fingerprint led authorities to 61-year-old Thomas McDowell, who had allegedly bragged to others about having kidnapped and murdered Jessica. He has since been charged with her murder.
We will be right back after a quick commercial break.
Hey y'all, we are Wendy and Beth. She's Wendy and I'm Beth. And we want to tell you about a podcast that we host called Fruit Loops Serial Killers of Color.
Fruit Loops is a podcast about true crimes committed by people of color and the victims that we don't hear or know much about. Contrary to popular belief, not all serial killers are straight, cisgender, white dudes. No, ma'am.
Join us at Fruit Loops as we tell fascinating stories of true crimes committed by people of color and their victims that often go untold by the mainstream media. As we dive into these cases, we get into the historical and cultural context of the crimes and the criminals in order to get a sense of what might have influenced the perpetrators and led to the crimes.
And that's right. New episodes drop every Thursday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. So until then, look alive, y'all. It's crazy out there.
And we're back.
Now, before we get into our story, we just want to say that while our tone is light in the intro, we do take the topics we're discussing very seriously. We are best buds and we love chatting together every week and turning it into a podcast. We want to share that passion with you and to create a vibe where all of you feel like our best buds too. We joke about us friends forming a cult or commune, but that's not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, which we do occasionally talk about in our weekly stories. We feel it's important to open up and talk about even the darkest aspects of humanity and the downright scary things that come up in the news. But we want to make it clear that our intention is never to sensationalize, and we always try to deliver these stories with respect to all parties involved or affected by the crimes we discuss.
We always post our sources in the episode description, so you can do some digging on your own if a story we present piques your interest. But you should know that if you ever feel we get it wrong, either in our tone or in the details of the case, we want to hear about it. We are more than happy to make a correction or give an update on a case we've discussed in previous episodes. So feel free to reach out to us at MurderMurder.news@gmail.com.
Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include human trafficking, child sex trafficking, child sexual abuse, child rape, torture, talk of starvation, domestic abuse, gun violence, and kidnapping. So if any of those are particularly sensitive subjects for you, you might want to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
So today we're going to cover the case that has haunted me ever since I first heard about it 5 years ago from the Once Upon a Crime podcast created by the very talented Esther Ludlow. If you couldn't tell from our trigger warnings, this case really has it all, from female serial killer sisters to an amazing tale of survival that brought down a child sex trafficking / murder ring in the 1960s. So you also get some interesting vintage look into this as well. We're going to talk about the Gonzalez sisters, who are very commonly referred to as Las Poquianchis, who were finally arrested on this day in true crime history in 1964 after murdering at least 91 people, probably quite a few more. The crimes were so prolific that they actually made the Guinness World Record for most prolific murder partnership, which is maybe something that does not need to be awarded. Pretty cringe.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what the heck? Who's aspiring to be the most prolific, murder partnership to get the award from Guinness?
Yeah, it's weird that it's something that they report on. I can understand being curious about, who has murdered the most number of people. You know, it's certainly something I've Googled. But
a world record?
Yeah.
That seems like an achievement.
Yeah, it does.
That's weird as heck.
Don't like that. We can probably just go ahead and delete this category.
Yeah, thank you. Our sources for today include Once Upon a Crime, of course, Fruit Loops, Millenio.com, LaPrensa.com, Medium, Latin Post, and more. For a full list of all of our amazing sources, please check out our show notes. You likely already know that we like to tell stories through a victim-first lens, but unfortunately, because of the way this case was recorded at the time and because of the way many of the victims were kidnapped, there doesn't seem to be a list of victims or any information about individual victims. We apologize for that in advance, but let's jump into a little background information about the Gonzalez sisters.
The Gonzalez sisters were born in the early 1900s in El Salto de Juanacatlán, Jalisco, to parents Isidro Torres and Bernardina Valenzuela. Delfina was the oldest born in either 1909 or 1912, depending on the source. Maria del Carmen, born in 1918. Maria de Jesus, who was nicknamed Chewy, who I am told by Esther, that's actually a very common nickname for this name in Latinx culture. And she was born in 1920. Also, Maria Luisa, nicknamed Eva the Leggy One, born in 1924. Their father worked as what we understand was basically a local militia serving as the rural police, and he would ride through town on horseback, keeping order, but he was known for abusing his power. Their mother was very religious and was known for going to church every day. Their father was an incredibly abusive alcoholic, and he was known for his machismo attitude. This was common during this time, especially in Mexico and especially in Catholic families, but he basically believed that it was his job to tightly control his wife and daughters because it was his responsibility as a man.
To him, part of that responsibility meant he needed to control the way his daughters looked to make sure they were not being too overtly sexual. If they wore makeup or dressed in a way that he deemed to be too provocative, he would beat them or lock them up in jail to teach them a lesson. When the girls would complain to their mother about their abuse, she would tell them to pray about it. At one point, Carmen began a secret relationship with an older man, which is something that is not too uncommon for children trying to escape from abusive households. She made a plan to run away with this man and get married to get away from her father, but he ended up tracking her down, beating her, and then throwing her in jail. Just a note that we read conflicting accounts of the next part of this story, but it sounds like while Carmen was in jail, her father, never one to shy away from abusing his authority, shot a man. Some accounts say he shot the man while overstepping his authority as a police officer, and some say it was over a dispute he had had with the man. Some accounts make it sound like he killed one man over a dispute and then later shot another while trying to arrest him. Whatever the case was, it was believed he then went on the run, seemingly forgetting Carmen was locked up. She stayed in jail for 14 months until a local grocer offered to post her bail with the intent to marry her.
The next part of the timeline is also a little fuzzy, and we weren't quite sure what happened to the Gonzalez sisters' parents. Some reports say her parents died, and they were left a small inheritance as a result. Some say the girls just changed their last name to their mother's maiden name, which was Valenzuela, to avoid being identified as the daughters of their fugitive father. Nonetheless, their parents did seem to be out of the picture, leaving the girls to fend for themselves, which meant they had a bit of freedom from their controlling father for the first time. Maria Luisa and Delfina briefly got jobs at a local textile shop, but it paid very little, and the sisters were very afraid of being poor, which was a fear they seemingly inherited from their parents. In 1938, Carmen began dating a man, Jesus Vargas, who was a criminal and con man, and the two opened a small cantina together. Jesus started skimming money from the register, and the store soon had to shut down. But the small success of the cantina got the sisters thinking that they just might be able to make a more substantial living by owning their own business. The sisters' next move was to open a saloon together in San Pancho, which is a nickname for San Francisco. The saloon did make some money, but they were basically just scraping by with enough money to put food on the table.
For obvious reasons, that was not satisfactory for them, and they began working on a plan to grow their business. They started off by trading sexual favors to policemen to look the other way while they served alcohol after hours and to keep a good distance from their saloon so patrons didn't feel threatened. The business continued to grow, and Carmen, working as the accountant for the saloon, worked to get permits for the business to operate legally as a seedy hotel for young people to visit, and to become a brothel known as Guadalajara de Noche. It quickly became one of the most famous, bustling brothels in town. But the sisters had decided they were not interested in paying sex workers for their work, and they would like to keep the money themselves. And this is where their reign of terror begins. At first, the sisters would take turns traveling to local towns and villages to recruit young girls. They would claim that they were offering them big opportunities to work Guadalajara or León as maids or waitresses. They would recruit girls between the ages of 12 and 15, horrific, and the families of the girls felt that allowing their daughters to work in the big cities would provide them with opportunities to make more money for their families. Once the girls got to the brothel, they realized they'd been tricked and were actually being sex trafficked and held against their will.
The sisters used abusive techniques to break down the girls and keep them from resisting their captivity. They had quite a few men who worked at the brothel to make sure the girls complied and to make sure they didn't escape. Once the girls arrived at the brothels, these men would immediately strip them down and rape them. The girls were intentionally kept underfed and nearly starving and were locked within the brothel gates, never seeing the light of day or allowed outside. They were fed meals of only tortillas and frijoles and were often locked in a room alone and starved as punishment. Conditions at the brothel have been compared to concentration camps. It was dirty and dingy, and the girls were often filthy and unwashed, and the high walls were topped with razor wire to keep them from escaping.
When a girl was impregnated, which of course was relatively common, she was made to have an abortion. We're not entirely sure what abortion would have been like in Mexico in the 1950s and 60s, but we do know that it was illegal at this time, and abortions were a big risk. Since doctors could not provide abortions legally, the ones being performed were very dangerous. There were no repercussions for abortions gone wrong, since the people seeking abortions could not report it to the police if they ended up sick, in pain, or worse. As the Gonzalez sisters clearly did not care about the safety or well-being of their captives, we can assume they were not using high-end, caring doctors to treat the girls. We do know that many of the girls at the brothel either bled to death or died from untreated illness as a result of these forced abortions. Occasionally, if a baby was accidentally carried to term, the boys would be killed and disposed of, and the girls would be kept to be used as future workers of the brothel. If a girl resisted, did not comply with the rules, was sick, or tried to escape, she would be placed in a room alone without food or water and often left to die.
Sometimes to teach them a lesson, the Gonzalez sisters would take things a step further, would make the other girls beat a girl to death with their hands, rocks, and sticks. Their bodies were buried in mass graves at Loma de Angel, one of their brothels near León. The girls had a big motivation to look nice and keep up their appearances because if they were too old or no longer attractive to the clients of the brothel, they would also be killed either by starvation or the other girls. This meant that the Gonzalez sisters would sell them clothes and makeup for a high price to further profit off their victims. As part of their initiation process, the girls were often given cocaine or heroin so they would be easier to control and manage. The children of the brothel were clearly seen as disposable to the Gonzalezes, and they had no motivation to try to keep them alive. When a girl was no longer seen as useful to them, they would simply kill them and go recruit more girls. As you can imagine, people in the towns around the brothel started to gossip about what the sisters were up to, and no one wanted to send their daughters to a brothel, of course. The Gonzalez sisters had to vary their tactics from going to recruit girls in nearby towns to posting ads in newspapers in larger cities like Mexico City. And finally, they just started using their henchmen to go kidnap girls from local farms and towns.
You might now be asking yourself, why didn't anyone stop the brothel if girls were coming up missing all around town? It's probably not a huge surprise that there are corrupt police and politicians everywhere who are willing to turn their heads for a chance to rape a young girl. And that's exactly what was happening here. The sisters would strategically hold back the prettiest girls to trade their virginity to the most important politicians and officials in exchange for their silence and protection. While most of the murders were victims of sex trafficking, the sisters would also murder some of the wealthy clients of the brothel. If a man came in waving around a lot of money, They would also have their henchmen murder them and steal their money, then burn them or bury them in the mass graves.
As you might expect, the sisters were making a ton of money, and they continued to expand their sex trafficking empire by opening brothels in San Francisco del Rincon, Purísima del Rincon, León in Guanajuato, San Juan de los Lagos, and San Juan del Rio near Mexico City. And I'm so sorry if the pronunciations of those are not good. My Spanish is so terrible.
You did so much better than I could have.
We did research this, and we had our lovely friend Alfonsina send us recordings of how to properly say these in Spanish. So I'm very sorry if I butchered these, but I did practice. They also opened a bar in Lagos, Jalisco, that they purchased from a gay man nicknamed Las Poquianchis. The name followed the bar and then followed the sisters, who became known as Las Poquianchis. We searched far and wide for the meaning of this term and have come up dry. The name does not have any meaning in Spanish, and we've checked many sources on that. And it seems like other journalists and podcasters who have covered this case couldn't get to the bottom of it either. We also asked Alfonsina, who is from Mexico City, and she actually has a tiny tie to this case, which we'll get to a little bit later. And she concurred that it must have just been a random nickname for the man, maybe related to his actual name. But nonetheless, the sisters hated the nickname, which should bring you all a tiny ounce of joy in an otherwise very bleak story.
The sisters clearly had no problem planning and organizing their murder ring, but they had quite a bit of help as well. Aside from the police, politicians, and officials who raped the girls and were sometimes just paid to look the other way, they also had quite a few workers at the brothels kidnapping and monitoring the girls. An ex-army captain named Zuniga, who went by Black Eagle, worked as an enforcer for the Gonzalezes and was believed to be Delfina's lover and possibly the father of her child. Salvador Estrada Bocanegra, known as the Executioner, would kill girls and get rid of the bodies. Delfina's son, Ramon Torres, who of course also had a nickname, El Tepo, worked as muscle by scaring the girls and keeping them in line. As a side note, we asked Alfonsina about the nickname El Tepo as well, and she said this nickname could have been an abbreviation for El Teperocho, which means the drunk. Countless others worked for the sisters in their brothels, well aware that young girls were being abducted, raped, abused, starved, and murdered, all while doing nothing to stop it.
The brothels raged on through the 1950s into the 1960s, but in 1963, the Gonzalezes would get dealt a big blow. In 1963, Delfina's son, Ramon, got into a fight with a police officer at one of their brothels. Ramon was shot to death by a cop, and the police temporarily shut down the brothel as a result. Delfina was angry about her son and sent the Black Eagle to get revenge and kill the cop who shot her son. And now we get to our survivor story, and we really, really wish we could tell you more about her, but we could not find any information about her age or how long she was held captive or about her life outside of the brothel. But we do know that mid-January of 1964, a girl did manage to escape the clutches of the Gonzalez sisters. Catalina Ortega had been locked up at one of the sisters' properties known as Loma de Angel, which was the main ranch where all the bodies were taken. Catalina had been desperately trying to escape for her life when she managed to squeeze out of a small opening in a wall. The Black Eagle was alerted and immediately began scouring the area around the ranch trying to track her down. But Catalina managed to get to a safe place and contacted her mother, Virginia Martinez de Ortega. She then went to a police station in León, Guanajuato with her mom, which you could imagine was a big risk. The Gonzalezes had bribed all of the cops in the area, so there was no saying what the police would do to Catalina and her mother. Luckily for them, the police at the station were not on the sisters' payroll.
Phew.
Victory! Finally, some good news.
Yes. After so much horrible stuff.
I know. I can't imagine. Poor things.
Ugh. Catalina was filthy and malnourished. The police officers could not believe the story they were hearing and quickly got a search warrant for the sisters, Guadalajara de Noche, and Loma del Angel. On January 14th, so 58 years ago today, the police arrived at Loma del Angel to find around a dozen girls between the ages of 13 and 17 being held captive. The police and journalists who arrived could not believe what they were seeing. The girls were all starving and told stories about the horrors they had endured. They showed police where bodies were buried and told them of the rape, abuse, and murder that had taken place behind the walls of the ranch. Delfina and Chewy were arrested and taken to jail for questioning. Carmen had actually died of cancer in the 1950s, and Luisa went on the run near Mexico City, but later turned herself in. The case at the time was highly publicized, and journalists and villagers gathered at the ranch for photos and to try and seek vengeance on the sisters. There are many pictures of Delfina and Chewy casually standing around dressed in black. At the time, they were still in mourning for Delfina's son, Ramon, and they were dressed in pretty traditional Catholic clothes.
The two showed no remorse and looked pretty unbothered by what was happening in the interview photos. They did show police where the bodies were buried and didn't seem to deny what they had done. As we mentioned, the townspeople were pissed. There had been rumors about the murders for years, and many people had their daughters, sisters, and friends kidnapped by the Gonzalezes, never to be heard from again. There were many people there who had had missing family and were hoping to finally get answers. A mob was forming, and the people wanted the sisters lynched. For their safety, they were moved to a prison in nearby small town Irapuato, which is where our friend Alfonsina's family is from. And she somehow has never heard of this story, even with her family being from there. And she said it's a very small town, so that's really wild that she hadn't heard of it.
And it's an old story, yeah.
Right. But this would have been certainly her parents' generation, so so it's interesting that she hadn't heard this before. But thanks again to Alfonsina for all of your help and research. She sent us great articles in Spanish because so much more rich information were contained there. So thank you so much for that information.
Yes.
So upon searching the property at Loma del Angel, the remains of 91 girls, men, and fetuses were uncovered.
Yikes.
Yeah, so many.
The trial made headlines nationwide, and all of the survivors testified about the terrible things they had been subjected to at the brothel. They talked about how they'd been kidnapped, drugged, tortured, starved, and made to have abortions, and how they were forced to beat other girls to death. The girls also told stories of satanic rituals, about bathing in animal blood, and being made to have sex with the animals while the sisters participated. They just keep one-upping themselves, huh?
Well, let's come back to that.
Quite a few sources mention this, but we aren't sure if this is part of the legacy of the story or if this was actually part of their testimony in court. When the podcast Fruit Loops covered the Gonzalez sisters, they mentioned that it's so common for people to mention witchcraft and Satanism when referencing female killers. Yeah,
Right.
That makes sense.
Right. 'Cause I read
We do hear a
this-
lot of those rumors.
Yeah. And I had my doubts as soon as I read that. Like from all accounts that I've read, the sisters were incredibly Catholic and very religious. And the mixing of Satanism into that didn't really seem
unlikely.
to fit their MO. And I'm not a serial killer and maybe there's things I'm missing. It kind of sounded like a legend that just kind of grew and spiraled instead.
They're just leaning into the sensation of it all and being like,
Exactly.
oh yeah, there was all sorts of satanic shit too.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, as Aurora just mentioned, the sisters were all devout Catholics. And so now we have our doubts about satanic rituals actually being involved, but who knows?
Yeah.
You could make the argument that if they were willing to traffic and murder young girls, how religious could they have been? But the Catholic Church and most religions certainly have a long history of blood on their hands.
Yep.
During the trial, the girls also gave detailed information about bribes paid to the police, politicians, and officials.
The three sisters were found guilty of 91 murders, plus the kidnappings of at least 100 girls, and were each sentenced to 40 years in prison, which was the maximum sentence at the time in Mexico. According to Once Upon a Crime, at least 19 other participants were tried for their involvement in the rapes and murders of the girls, but they could not verify who was charged and what their sentences may have been. We really do hope that there were repercussions for the men who were paid bribes as well.
Mm-hmm.
There were reports that the money from the brothels went to the survivors, which we hope is true, because it sounds like they were quite rich. And like, what were they doing with all this money they must have been making?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah. So Delfina served the shortest term, and there was speculation that her mental health took quite a beating. She was paranoid about being murdered while in prison and suffered extreme anxiety as a result. On October 17th, 1968, just 4 years after being arrested, she was having intense anxiety over men doing repairs in her jail cell. The men were up on scaffolding, patching a wall, while Delfina was said to be crying down below. The distraction supposedly caused one of the workers to accidentally knock a bucket of cement onto Delfina's head. She later died from those injuries.
Wow, what a way to go. That's super unusual, too. I've never heard something like that.
Very strange way to go. And different reports, some say that she died instantly. Some say she, had brain injuries and died over the course of weeks.
Yeah, I could picture sensational rumors being like, and then she was turned into a cement statue where she still lives in the
yes, a haunted
in
statue in the prison.
Yeah.
That would be interesting, actually.
Yeah. Actually, that would make a good, like horror movie, ghost story kind of thing,
Right. Yes. Like you could pick up from that point. Like any part of this would make a really awful and disgusting horror movie, but like then picking up at this like terrible woman who killed 91 people and her ghost haunting the cement in her jail cell is pretty good.
It's like a perfect circle. It's awesome. On November 19th, 1984, Maria Luisa was found dead in her cell, and legend says she had been dead for a while when they found her, and she was being eaten by rats. And somehow, Chewy was paroled early, though we couldn't find any information on when or why. We found one source that said she was released in 1978, which would have been only after serving 14 years in prison. Supposedly, she met a 64-year-old man while in prison, and the two went on to live their lives in private after her release.
It seems way too good for her.
Yeah, way too good.
Yeah.
In 2002, there was one more update to this sad story. While building a new housing development near Loma del Angel, a mass grave was discovered with skeletal remains of over 20 people. Investigators believe that the remains had been buried in the 1950s or 60s, and they do believe that these were additional victims of the Gonzalez sisters. If that is the case, this would mean they murdered over 110 people. And that is the story of Las Poquianchis. Wow.
Yeah.
That's perhaps the most prolific story we've ever discussed on the show.
It's a really sad case. And I had never heard this before. Like, I don't know that this is like a commonly known story in the U.S. And I was actually living in Mexico when I listened to Esther's podcast about it. And like,
scary.
Just had to like look up every last detail about it. Like I'd never heard something so horrific and sad. And Esther does a really good job of telling the story as well. So I highly recommend going to check her podcast out.
Go listen to that after this.
She's such a great storyteller too. So it's really haunted me ever since. Like I think about this all the time. I think about, like we have found ourselves in this world of like sex trafficking and stuff. Like one of our good friends, y'all may have heard an earlier episode we did with Victoria from the Trafficking Truth podcast. She was, somebody kidnapped her and attempted to traffic her when she was younger. And like, it's just amazing how much time I spend thinking about these like terrible things that are still happening now. It's still so common.
Yeah, absolutely. That episode was really chilling because Victoria shared that it was like someone that she knew and didn't expect to abduct her, which is like, I mean, these things are terrible no matter how you spin them, but it's just so difficult to wrap your head around the idea of people that you know and trust, or people that just seem like ordinary people that are out there doing absolutely horrific things.
Right.
Very creepy. So have you been watching anything murdery while you've been cooped up in bed sick with COVID?
Yeah, I've had plenty of time to watch TV this week. And after we recorded our podcast like last week, that's pretty much all I did was watch TV.
Yeah.
And I watched a couple things. I did watch Yellow Jackets, which you had recommended last week. I'm on like episode maybe 6. And
I think you're ahead of me.
Oh.
I think I just watched episode 5.
Okay. Because as soon as I watched episode 1, I was like, I'm watching this whole thing tonight. I'm not sleeping until I have resolution. And like, I'm
so good,
into it. And my husband is not. And he watched he liked it, but like he watched the first episode, and he can't watch shows that are too anxiety inducing for him. Like he can only watch like one episode of a tense show a day, and then he has to watch something a little bit more mellow. And so he's like, okay, let's watch another tomorrow. And I was like, what?
You're like, cannot wait for you.
We are getting a divorce.
Louis had the opposite reaction, where Louis saw, I guess he was coming in and out of the first episode as I was watching it, because he was like half asleep in bed, and I think he was drifting in and out of sleep. And so he was making small comments on it here and there, like he was sort of half watching. But then the next day, he was like, oh, I'm busy doing this thing, so why don't you put on your boring soccer show or whatever? And I'm like, you clearly missed a lot of that episode, because it's like definitely not a boring soccer show. No. Like, what the hell?
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. But so then like I tried watching the next day, the second episode with Rick, and he turned it off halfway through and was like, no, I can't do this. I just can't with this like style of storytelling. Aww. So I was like, no problem. I guess I'll just have to watch it on myself. And then
what a shame.
Yeah. And so then I was just off to the races. It's like all I can think about, and I can't wait to watch some more episodes tonight after this, because it's just wonderful.
Yeah.
Christina Ricci is everything.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
I actually, like, yesterday, I posted a story on our site that I found from E! Online, I think, that's just like, it's talking about a murder that took place in the show and whatever, and it was saying, spoiler alert, and la la la. I actually managed to find a way to post it without subjecting myself to the spoiler.
Oh,
so
good.
I'm waiting to see what the heck happened.
Right.
That's a feat. I don't know.
My favorite part so far is there's this great scene where Christina Ricci's in it, and she's just like, I don't even know how to explain her. She's like this deranged nurse, and she just has like so much like intense energy. And they like flash to a scene with her where she's just making a list of objects. It's like escalators, knuckles, steamed clams. And then she's just like naming all these weird things. She's like, those are my turn-ons. What are yours?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And the guy's just like saying nothing.
His eyes are just like enormous. Like, what is happening? Like, I'm like, I love her so much. I wish we were friends. But like,
yeah, so hilarious. She just muscles her way into friendships. She's just like, I'm hanging out with you whether you like it or not. Very amazing.
I love it. She's great. It's great. Definitely. Everybody go check it out and let's talk about it.
And also, Aurora, you just told me today that the latest season of Search Party, which we both loved and couldn't get enough of, has been released. So we and all of you monsters should also go and watch that right now, because I'm sure it's going to be amazing. It's the last season, you said?
It's the final season, unfortunately, which is so sad to see it go. But I can't wait to watch all 10 episodes of those in one day.
Same. And I've watched nothing else to speak of. We actually spent the week, we watched every single Star Wars movie.
Oh.
So there are, I think it's 11 or 12 movies. So that was a week.
That is a lot. I've never seen a Star Wars.
Well, I can tell you about all of them. I'll tell you which ones you can skip and which ones you can't, which I guess I already knew, except that, like, I guess, you know, the first time around, everybody knows that they're all out of order, of course, but the first 3 movies, which the first trilogy, I guess, it's all sort of jumbled around. The ones that came out in the 2000 or something like that are the worst ones, because that's the one with Jar Jar Binks and whatever. And there's a lot of
watching
weird
one of those, and I left the theater after
those are
about
bad.
like 20 minutes.
They're very bad. Yeah. But the best, I think, is not the first trilogy, which came out in the 80s, but the most recent one, which came out like just a few years ago. I love it. It's got like a girl protagonist that's like that's the hero of the story, which is really cool. Very different.
I did watch one of those because I love Oscar Isaac so much, and I saw he was in it, but I didn't understand what was happening, so I don't have an opinion about it. Like, I think I needed to see the other ones to like. Yeah, I know what a Baby Yoda is.
Oh yeah, I like the Baby Yoda. That's the best part for sure. The shows are better than the movies, even, I'd say. Yeah, but yeah, if you ever have like 20 random hours to kill because you're like stuck on your couch with COVID like me, then maybe you'll watch every Star Wars movie. Maybe not.
I still have time. I've made no progress in a week, so maybe next week I will have time.
We might just be in this phase for like 6 months. Who knows?
Yeah. Oh, I did watch another weird, like true crimey kind of British cop show on Netflix. I watched Stay Close, I think it's called.
Oh, never heard of it.
Wow. It's, I'd love to hear what other people thought about it. It's very cheesy. And like, I don't understand, like they're trying to do like a mix of like comedy with, like a true crime backdrop. Comedy. Like there's like a mystery that's trying to be solved, and somebody
sounds interesting.
There's like a serial killer like backdrop kind of thing, and you don't know it's a serial killer. Maybe that's a spoiler, sorry, but it's kind of obvious in the beginning, but it might be a little bit of a spoiler, sorry. But wow, it was not great. And I just kept watching it because I didn't have anything else to watch, but it's so weird. The pacing's so weird. I'd like to know like who the audience is intended for. Like.
Interesting. I'm not sure whether I want to look at that or not, but I guess who knows?
Watch it unless you're like just completely out of everything else to watch in the entire world.
That might happen.
It might. We also wanted to let you all know that we just rolled out a brand new website. Things were getting a bit messy with the old format, and we just wanted to present you with a nice, slick, streamlined version of MMN. So if you haven't seen the new site yet, type MurderMurder.news into your browser and make sure you bookmark our site. If you're on your phone, you can even save it to your home screen so you'll have one-touch access to MMN whenever you need it.
I guess that's enough murder for 1 week. If you need just a touch more murder, you can always find us on the OG MurderMurder.news for the latest breaking true crime news every day of the week.
You can also find us on Instagram at MurderMurder.news, on Twitter at MurderNews, on TikTok at MurderMurder.news, where we just released a 2-part series on the Black Dahlia murder, which is something, very well known by murderinos, but I kind of went on this deep dive this past week while I was bored looking into potential suspects, because I was like, I'm freaking solving this week. I'm going to do it. And I did learn some like really interesting things. So go check out that video, because for a long time I have believed that it's probably George Hodel, but I kind of have some doubts now. Like there's a couple other suspects that look interesting. So go watch that and let us know what you think.
I'm going to want to do some more research there too, and we're going to want to talk about this some more, I think, because I definitely am team George Hodel as the suspect at the moment. But there's always new information to pick up. As old as this story is, it is a long-standing unsolved cold case with so many mysterious tie-ins. So, there's lots of information. Even if you think you've heard inside out the Black Dahlia story, there's always more to hear.
Agreed. And when I was researching the story to do for our week, or like our true crime history thing on our TikTok we do on Sunday, I was a little nervous about taking on such a big case for like a 3-minute video. And I was like, I better really know what I'm saying with this if I'm going to like everybody knows it so well. If I get one thing wrong, everyone will let me know and be very angry about it. So I listened to quite a few podcasts about it, like from experts and detectives and stuff. And one of the ones I listened to was The Murder Squad with Paul Holes. And he did a pretty good breakdown of why he believes that the incisions did not need to be made by a doctor. Like, it's just the most logical place, like where she was amputated in her waist. Like, it's beneath the rib cage and above like the hip bone. It's actually quite obvious. And from what he read in the notes, it was actually done in quite a sloppy way. Like, there were injuries to organs that like a doctor probably wouldn't have made. And it was a really interesting analysis. Which like gave me second thoughts, but then they had brought up another suspect I hadn't heard of that new information the police had held back. And like, that's pretty telling.
All right, we're gonna have to like do this for like an episode or maybe a special Patreon. We're coming back to this.
Yeah, we'll come back to it because, you know, I feel more confused than ever. I'm not saying it's not George Hodel, but like, it did give me second thoughts because for a while I had just been like, oh, obviously it's George Hodel. But this reminded me that it's much more complex and there's reason, you know, like investigators do what they do because, you know, it's much more complicated than my small brain can wrap itself around. So definitely go check out our TikTok and let us know what you think. And maybe we've missed something, or maybe you have a podcast suggestion or a book suggestion or something that we are missing. So let us know. And you can also find us, of course, in our Facebook page just by looking for Murder Murder News.
And when you search for Murder Murder News on Facebook, you will also see our group pop up. You'll want to hit that join button to stay in the loop about any upcoming events we may have and to join our virtual book club.
Which we have not taken care of yet, but I swear we will.
But we're doing it. We're doing it.
February, I promise. We'll get.
Yeah. We're going to have a February book club.
Yes.
We've got our wheels turning in our brains, and we've got some ideas. We're just going to start getting it out there.
Perfect.
So join that group, join our book club, and we'll see you in February for our next book club meeting. And we'll see you next week for our next episode. And thanks for being here. Have a great week.
Bye, friends.
Bye.